All right. Well, welcome. We're going live across the internet right now for special Christmas and New Year's episode of Political Trade Secrets. If you've ever wondered how American history is playing out even to this day, with many Christmas moments throughout our history and how they've affected persuasion and even some propaganda strategy and our patriotic sense of national unity and how that still has an influence today. We're going to be talking about a number of interesting topics around Valley Forge, which happened, almost 250 years, 248 years ago at this point. And then additionally, we'll talk about Thomas Nast and his Civil War propaganda and how it still influences us today. We'll talk about the War of 1812. We'll talk about the first ball drop in Times Square lighted, and then also we'll talk about a Christmas story and how it led to one of the biggest media scams of all time. So with that, thank you for joining during the show. If you have questions, comments, whatever, if you're part of the live stream, you can be a part of it and you can have those answered and you can be part of the conversation. So without further ado, here we are with Political Trade Secrets.
Welcome to Political Trade Secrets, an inside look at campaigns and politics, where we pull back the curtain, look under the hood, and investigate all aspects of politics and how elections are won. Now, here's your host, Dustin Olson.
Pollster and host of the Political Trade Secrets podcast, Dustin Olson.
Dustin Olson.
Dustin Olson.
And Dustin Olson, pollster at American Pulse. They work for both Republicans and Democrats. And he hosts a podcast, Political Trade Secrets. Oh, we love that. We like that podcast.
Now, from Washington, D.C., is pollster Dustin Olson.
And welcome to Political Trade Secrets. I'm your host, Dustin Olson, and looking forward to having you all join us here today. We're going to be talking about Christmases past and going on into the present. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for this. As you know, what we do here, we like to pull back the curtain, look under the hood, and show you what it looks like to be in politics and in the media. And today, we're going to be talking about how that actually is important when it comes to Christmas and New Year's, and how we have a lot of historic moments throughout our history that have shaped who we are as a country and still impact our politics to this day. So we're going to have on, just like we did with Thanksgiving, we're going to have historic storyteller, author, and syndicated columnist J. Mark Powell, who's a friend, former reporter, journalist, worked at CNN and was a news anchor and in newsrooms all across the country. And he's has a new book coming out in February called Witness to War, and we'll talk to him about that as well. But looking forward to the conversation, and really just how, if you've ever wondered about how some of these things work, like we're going to talk about a mass media a scandal with the New York Times bestseller list. We'll be talking about Gene Shepard, who was the author of A Christmas Story, that we're all familiar with, but one of his biggest pranks on the American people. We'll be talking about that. That'll be fun. We'll talk about the War of 1812. We'll talk about George Washington at Valley Forge and Thomas Nast and his war propaganda and how it gave us our modern Santa Claus. So lots of really interesting stuff that we'll get to talk about here in the program. Wherever you are, we would really appreciate if you'd like, follow, and subscribe to the podcast. That's the best way to help us. And that way we can get the show everywhere. So if you can like, follow, and subscribe, we really would appreciate that. And that really does make a difference for the show. Without further ado, though, I'd like to bring in our guest, J. Mark Powell. So, Mark, it's great to have you here today. And I think my producer's having a little bit of a challenge here, so we'll just hold for one moment. And I'll come in and help him for 1 second. All right. Here we go. Mark, it's great to have you on today, and thank you for taking the time to talk about these stories. We got a lot of positive feedback from our last episode, and and people really did enjoy learning about the history of Thanksgiving and how it impacts our politics today to this day. And looking forward to this. And I thought we might go back to the Revolution. This coming up in 2026 is going to be our 250th anniversary. We had an episode years ago where we talked about George Washington's crossing of the Delaware and how that was an important moment, obviously, in the war, but that happened on Christmas night, 1776. So we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of that next year. This will be the 249th anniversary of it. But also back in 1777, that was one of the bleakest winters of the Revolution. And George Washington there at Valley Forge, celebrating Christmas. And we have this iconic image from that time period, the prayer at Valley Forge. This is a painting of that was done for the 200th anniversary of the bicentennial painting, Arnold Freeberg's depiction of Washington kneeling there at Valley Forge and praying for the war effort. But with that, we're going to get started. And you have a new book out, obviously, Witness to War. It's about the Civil War, but going back to this war, what was that like at that time for the men who were there at Valley Forge?
It was a very dire situation for Washington, for Washington's men, for the fate of the country, for the entire revolution. Pardon me. By the way, I'm very proud. My fifth great-grandfather, Charles Powell, was there as a sergeant in the Virginia Line Artillery. So it's very meaningful for me personally. To understand the significance of Washington and the Battle of Trenton and Washington crossing the Delaware, you got to understand the context. It had been a very bad summer and fall for George Washington and the Patriot cause. Washington's army has been pushed down the east coast of the U.S. They've lost New York City, and then in late September, they're driven out of Philadelphia. That's very symbolic. That's where they had just declared independence on July 4th, and it was the capital of the Continental Congress, or at least that's where the Continental Congress met. So in a sense, it was like the early capital of the United States. So losing that was a big blow. They're pushed back across into Valley Forge in the country outside of Philadelphia. In January of 1776, Washington had roughly 15,000 men in his army. By December, that was down to 10,000.
Wow.
Between 10 and 11,000. So he's lost 30%, largely through desertion and battle casualties. More so than that, the enlistment period for a big percentage of his remaining army is due to come up early in 1777. And a bunch of those guys are going home. There's just no sense sticking around in this miserable situation if they're losing. So Washington knows when his army's gone, the revolution's over. Doesn't matter. They can lose Philadelphia. They can lose the capital. If the army's gone, it's kaput. So he knows he's got to do something, and he's got to do it fast. And he finds out that Trenton, New Jersey, on the Delaware River, across from Pennsylvania, is garrisoned by just over 1,000 Hessian mercenaries. The Duchy of Hesse had rented in what's now modern Germany. You could buy armies.
Yeah,
the Brits had bought these guys.
Still the case.
Right. They bought them. They're here. And Washington was a master of espionage. He had quite an effective spy network throughout the entire revolution. And he says, hey, wait a minute. This is a prime military target that's ripe for the plucking, right? And he knows if we can pull this off, this will be a huge morale boost. Okay. However, to do it entails substantial risk. Okay, he's going to take 2,400 of his 10,000 guys. That's roughly 25%. If this goes bad, and if the Hessians have found out, they're waiting and they wipe them all out, it could be finito. Okay, but he also knows I got to do something. Now, 6 days before this, the week before this, Thomas Paine published The American Crisis. Remember, at the beginning of the Revolution, he's written Common Sense, and that really helped sway a lot of colonials to the Patriot cause. And the American crisis contains these famous words we've all heard, but this tells you the backdrop of what Washington's looking at when he's up against the wall. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. Okay. So Washington figures, well, it's use them or lose them. I might as well use them.
Mm-hmm.
So start on the night of December 25th. He knows these are Germans. Germans are huge Christmas fans. They are some of the biggest celebrants. They celebrate Christmas in German.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about this in a moment. Before we're going to talk about Thomas Nast in a little bit. Before our modern conception of Santa Claus, it was really the German.
That's right. So
Santa Claus. That was the image we had.
Then is now Germans are huge partiers, and he knows there's going to be, it's Christmas night. It's the dead of winter. They're not going to be expecting them, and they're going to be drunk. And let's roll the dice and go for it. And immediately everything goes bad. They leave just before sunset and march to the river, and a storm blows up. It's raining, sleeting, icing, very cold, 20 to 25 degrees, sub-freezing. That works to Washington's advantage, though, because, they don't know they're coming. And they're not likely to come on a night like this. So that works out. But it does create all kinds of headaches. The weather is so cold, 2 men die of exposure on the march to Trenton. Now think about that for a minute. They didn't fall in and drown in the river. They died in the cold weather, okay? Yeah. They catch the Hessians off guard. It's a brief, but it's a very, very fierce little battle. And the casualties, I think the casualties say it all. Three Patriots killed, 6 wounded, 22 Hessians killed, 98 wounded, and 1,000 captured. Wow. Bunches of muskets, bunches of gunpowder, bunches of cannons, even drums. And so they marched them back, and this was a morale grand slam home run. This convinced a lot of guys to say, yeah, hey, we can do this. Let's stay the course. And they tough it out through that miserable winter. And then not only does spring come to their rescue, but Ben Franklin's been busy in the court of Versailles in Paris while all this is going on. And he finally gets the French to sign an alliance and to send help. And when the French come over, then everything changes. And that's really why we're able to win the revolution. It was the French army, and more specifically, the French Navy that keeps the Brits from. Remember, the Brits got to send everything from across the ocean, and the French Navy is able to block them. And so it all ends happily ever after.
Yeah.
But if Washington hadn't taken this high risk gamble the night of December 25th, 1776, we'd probably be drinking tea and eating crumpets right now.
Yeah. Well, it was a pivotal moment. It's interesting. You fast forward to this day. There's actually a bill in Congress, I think, to do letters of marque. Is that what you call it? The modern soldiers of fortune, like the Hessians, and to have people actually go after these drug boats and be able to keep the whatever spoils, I guess, I don't know, that they capture, which is interesting to think that that's still something to this day people consider. But going into Valley Forge and in that moment, just kind of paint the picture of what it was like for an actual soldier.
One last thing before we leave crossing the Delaware, if I may. We've all seen the famous picture many, many times of where Washington is, on the front of the boat, leading the men forward. It's a beautiful picture. It's the painting is gigantic. It's massive. Yep. But it's also a fiction, because the boats they used were essentially cargo boats to get back and forth. And they would think of them as World War II landing crafts with those deep, deep bottoms and steep sides. Mm-hmm. So Washington would not have been hanging up on top like that.
Yeah, standing, directing them through the Delaware.
Right. And by the way, we talk about the difficulties in crossing the Delaware. It was even more difficult to get back because he's got 1,000 extra guys with him, and the weather is still lousy and getting lousier by the hour. And it was even a harder job to return. But they were elated. They pulled it off. The men were jubilant. And so, you know, that psychological impetus overcame the physical, their exhaustion and the bad weather. So Valley Forge was miserable, was just sheer misery. If you've ever been there, it's a national park now, and it's a lonely, barren hillside out in the middle of nowhere. You don't pass through Valley Forge to get to anywhere. You go to Valley Forge specifically, and that's why that location was chosen. They were undersupplied. Washington was always hounding Congress, more and more and more. We need everything, more and more and more. And it was just it was an unusually cold winter. Winter was colder then than it is now, because we obviously climate change. The history of Earth, the climate has changed over the millennia. The 1617 and 1800s, scientists now call it the end of what they call the Little Ice Age. It was an unusual cooling down. So it was even harsher and starker than it is today, but the men clung on. Ironically, you always hear the famous bloody footprints in the snow, and you hear about men starving. Most of the deaths actually occur in March and April, when spring weather comes and illness goes through and disease goes through. And that's where the most of the fatalities come. But once again, it has a happy ending, because they get word as they're about to leave Valley Forge that France has recognized them. This is so significant that Washington orders the cannons to fire salutes to celebrate it, because gunpowder was very scarce. They had to make so to just go firing cannons, but he knew this would be a big morale booster to the men. So
it makes sense.
he did it.
So this painting is fairly recent. It was on the 200th anniversary bicentennial, and it was commissioned for that purpose. Now, one of the most powerful, and actually one of the earliest depictions of Valley Forge, they obviously didn't have photography at the time, but it has a Christmas connection. I don't know if you know this, but a fellow by the name of Currier did a print of Washington at Valley Forge, it was basically the propaganda at the time of this is what happened. And it was Currier, of course, Currier and Ives, and the Christmas greeting cards. But he had depicted Washington at Valley Forge greeting the troops, and that is one of the earliest depictions. Obviously, he wasn't there, and he didn't actually see it, but that's what Americans knew as to what was actually happening there. Anything else on Valley Forge? But this is coming up in the next 2 years, and we're going to the 250th anniversary. Pretty much every week there is something that is a historic moment that's 250 years ago or 249 years ago at this point that our country went through at this point.
Martha Washington came up from Mount Vernon and spent the winter with him. Now, the general had a tiny little stone house. It wasn't as bad as guys. They weren't in tents. They were in little miniature log cabins. Think of them, little shacks. But it was still plenty cold and miserable. And if you've been to Mount Vernon's a lovely home. And she voluntarily gave that up to be there to lend support for George. I think that says a lot about their marriage.
Yeah, probably it was a nicer winter further south at Mount Vernon.
Yeah, but she chose to be there to go through that with him.
Yeah. Anything else on this? Otherwise, we can fast forward a few years to the War of 1812, and this is significant why it fits into our history, because obviously, well, first off, just tell people a little bit about the War of 1812. This is, if you go to the Smithsonian, you can find the Star-Spangled Banner, and that's where we got that from. So kind of paint the picture, but then there's going to be the Treaty of Ghent, which we'll talk about in a moment, which is important to Christmas.
Yeah, the War of 1812 is really a fascinating little story that just gets glossed over. It's kind of a speed bump in American history, and there's way much more to that. New England was the driving force. New England wanted that war, and there were several things going on. There were territorial disputes with England. Pardon me. We'd acquired Louisiana Territory. We weren't quite sure where the boundaries were, and there were lots of issues along that big long border we shared with England, with the British in Canada particularly. The English were meddling with Native Americans and getting Indians to cause trouble. That rubbed the wrong way. But what really did it is in the 1800s and 1810s, England is at war with Napoleon. And the British Navy, the largest navy in the world, it needed every man it could get. And it needed more sailors, than it had the ability to supply. And so they were essentially, it was called impressment. They were stopping American civilian merchant ships and finding trumped up charges to, at gunpoint, take sailors off and impress them in to the service of the Royal Navy. Their favorite claim was, oh, this guy's really a British citizen. Oh, he's a runaway from the British Navy. That was a paper thin tissues. They wanted men. Right.
Yeah.
And you take Americans, because they're not going to do it with Canada, because they don't want to tick off the Canadians, because that's their big toehold in North America. But it's open season on Americans. They're not happy that they've lost the Revolutionary War. This is like 25 years later. Okay. They're not happy about that. 30 years. I can't do math. They're not happy about, so they're not fond of Americans to begin with. And if you get Americans, they already speak English. You don't have a language problem. Okay. Well, you can imagine how that goes over. So finally, in the summer of 1812, Congress declares war, and President Madison, my third cousin, got to get that in, signs the declaration of war. England kind of views this as an annoying distraction, because they're fighting Napoleon.
Yeah,
that's the key thing, right? And that's one of the rationales for going to war, thinking, well, hey, they're tied up with Bonaparte on the continent. That'll give us free. And of course, they're itching, and particularly in the Northeast, Americans are itching to take Canada. Canada then, in the Revolution and Canada in the War of 1812, had no desire to join us whatsoever. There was no popular support, but they still go ahead and try. And in 1813, they invade Canada. We get our clocks clean both in the Revolution and in 1813. But we made a major miscalculation. We burned the city of York, which was the capital of what was called Upper Canada. There were two divisions of Canada at that time. And boy, the English, when word reached London, they thought this was uncivilized, barbaric. And the king said, it's time to show them who you're messing with. Yeah. So in 1814, now Napoleon has been defeated, okay? And now they can start paying attention to us. They send a force over, land at Maryland, march across to Washington, D.C. There's one tiny little battle at Bladensburg, Maryland, where the British brushed them aside like shooing away flies. President Madison, God love him, brilliant man, but had no military experience whatsoever. And yeah, he tried, but it's the only time in American history an American president has commanded troops in battle. They burn the Capitol, they burn the wall, they burn the White House, they burn most public buildings in the Capitol, which, not that there was much of the Capitol at that time.
That's the famous story of Dolly Madison saving George Washington.
Right. The Gilbert Stuart portrait, cracking it out of frame. Also, one of the unsung heroes of that situation was the head of the U.S. Patent Office. The Patent Office, for some reason, in this time before the Smithsonian Institution, was America's museum. Because when people submitted patents, they often, they did drawings, and sometimes they would make diagrams and models showing their inventions, and they put them on display. So I guess they figured, well, we've got this as a tourist attraction. He grabbed, literally as they were freeing, on the kind of like an afterthought, he grabbed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution off the wall and saved them. Saved Washington's uniform, Washington's tent. A lot of that stuff was by the hero bureaucrat.
Well, real quickly before we go into to Christmas Eve and the treaty that ends all this, supposedly it didn't actually end it, but just paint the picture really quickly about how we got this. This is at the American History Museum, the actual Star Spangled Banner.
Right, and that's where we're going. So they get it. The British go back to march back. And by the way, a storm blows up. They think it may have been a small hurricane, actually, the night that they burned Washington. that puts out the fires, and that's why the walls of Congress and the White House are saved. That's why we still have the original walls today, because of that. They get back, they march back to boats, they go and they sail upriver. And Baltimore is a much more important topic to them because it's a major port city, and they want Baltimore. But Baltimore has a masonry brick fort outside Fort McHenry, and when they get word that the Brits have landed, they start preparing. And one of the things they did was the women in the city start sewing this massive, larger than regulation called for sign, because the American general said, hey, I want that in your face, right? And so they sew the flag that is now the original Star Spangled Banner, the 15-star flag you just showed, and they wave that. The Brits come up and they bombard them all night long. And Francis Scott Key, a young Maryland lawyer, has gone to the British fleet before the attack begins to ask if he can negotiate release of American who was held captive. And they said, yeah, we'll let him go, but you got to stay on. We're about to attack, so you got to stay. So he watches the bombardment all night, and black powder guns. There's gun smoke. There's a lot of smoke, and it's dark, and he doesn't know. There's no lights, and he doesn't know what's going to happen. And so he nervously waits. And then the next morning when the sun comes up, our flag was still there. This huge flag that you're seeing there is still flying. And he writes the poem of Star Spangled Banner, which later becomes the national anthem. Okay. But otherwise, by the late summer, that's September 1814. So they push the British back. They don't take Baltimore, and that's a huge victory, particularly after having lost the capital. But everybody wants the war to be over. They're pretty sick of it, and Britain is sick not so much of the War of 1812. They're sick of war in general because they've been fighting Napoleon on and off for 10 years, and wars are very expensive. And they're running up a lot of money. And so they meet, delegates from both sides meet in the British city of Ghent, Belgium. I said British, in Belgium. The American delegation is headed by John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams and future U.S. president. And Henry Clay, my third cousin, got to work that in too, was this number 2 guy. And basically, the war, in all reality, the war was a draw. And they said, we'll quit fighting, and all of these issues, the impressment of sailors, the territorial disputes, all this stuff, we'll deal with that later. We'll just hit the reset button and go back to where we were in 1812. Okay. And it basically provided an off ramp to get away from the conflict. The thing of it is, it's interesting though, is there was no electronic communication this time. So
the important thing though, before we go into that, is that I don't know how long did they actually meet for, but it culminates with them signing.
They went on for a couple of months. It was a long, prolonged.
So maybe it's like Congress today. You got to get everything done. Christmas is the deadline, but they wanted to celebrate Christmas.
They wanted to get home. Yeah, that's for sure.
So it was signed. The Treaty of Ghent was signed Christmas Eve.
Christmas Eve, 1814. Correct. So while all this is going on, though, the Brits, have sent an army under General Pakenham to New Orleans, to try to seize New Orleans, because they know that peace negotiations are going, and they're hoping if they can control, because then as now New Orleans was a major port and commerce center, so they would like to grab that, so that when they essentially say, okay, it's all over, at least they'll be in possession of that, and possession is 9 points of the law, right? This army they're sending had beat Napoleon on the Spanish Peninsula. These are hardcore veterans, and so the Americans put together a ragtag, fascinating army, a handful of regular troops, militiamen from Tennessee and Kentucky, who, notice the guy in the buckskin clothes there. These are frontiersmen, right? Backwoods boys, and even pirates under the command of Jean Lafitte. They all come together. And on January 8th, 1815, now the war has been over, help me here,
that's almost
2 weeks. 2 weeks, but they don't know. So we have the single most decisive battle of the entire war fought after the war is over. And not only did the Americans win, they trounced them. They just kicked the stuffing out. General Pakenham is killed. They send his body back to England in a whiskey barrel to preserve it for the long voyage. His number 2 is mortally wounded. He dies. It's just, and this is what makes Andrew Jackson. This is what puts Old Hickory on the map nationally and sets him on the course of action that will lead to the presidency. Now, here's the thing. Though, because of this, and this is what gets so overlooked, the significance of the War of 1812 is Americans come out of it thinking we've won. We got this resounding, no doubt about it, victory, right? Mm-hmm. And what's really telling is it's a major infusion of self-confidence in the young America, because we had fought England and held our own entirely on our own. They knew that mom and dad and grandma and grandpa had to have the French in the 1770s to make it up to 1781 to make it happen. This time they did it on their own. It leads to an incredible infusion of self-confidence and optimism and positivity in America, culminating in the era of good feelings in the early 1820s. So it's a very significant chain of events that happen, and it all happened because of the treaty that was signed 211 years ago today, and because of the fact that a bunch of guys in New Orleans hadn't got word of that treaty.
Yep. There's nothing like getting the last punch. So far as we go through this, I mean, this is the through line through all these stories is the holidays, Christmas, but also the development of this national symbol and idea of who we are as Americans. You know, the bleakest winter, the revolution, and yet we were successful in Valley Forge. And then we go to 1812, and we have the actual symbol, the Star Spangled Banner comes out of that. We have the sense of America can stand on her own feet. And now we're going to move a little bit forward to the Civil War era and then Reconstruction. Before I do that, to help out the program, if you wouldn't mind liking, subscribing to us, following us wherever you're watching this podcast. It could be on YouTube, it could be on Rumble, it could be on X. We have tons of people on X following us. So wherever it is, just follow, like, subscribe. We really do appreciate it. And if you are following us on our social media, you will be notified when we go live, so you can actually participate in the conversation. You can post questions. So at any time during this conversation, you can post a question to myself or to Mark, and you can get your questions answered. So let's fast forward to the Civil War. And the thing I think is shocking. So these gentlemen here all became part of our national icons from the Civil War on. And this is obviously AI put this together, but this is these are representations of Thomas Nast, who is a cartoonist for Harper's Weekly, and in a way an early propagandist for the Union and for the United States, kind of ahead of Edward Bernays, who became famous 50 years later. But you have 4 icons that we still see today. So the modern Santa Claus, before that it was the Germanic, European, tall, thin Santa Claus. And then we get that. We'll talk about that in a moment. We get Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam was an idea before that. However, he's the one who made him into the Uncle Sam that we think of today in his political cartoons. And then he also gave us the Republican elephant and the Democrat donkey, which you're going to be able to tell us why all of those things in a moment. But those are all still with us to this day. And this is, I believe, this is the first representation of Santa Claus that he depicted. It's not the most famous one, but this is Santa Claus in camp, handing out presents to the Union troops. Is that right?
Yeah. Also called Saint Nicholas. Santa Claus visits the troop, or Saint Nicholas visits the troop. You see, it says Santa Claus up there. Mm-hmm. It's drawn by Thomas Nast. This is an interesting character. He's born in Germany, and his family comes over in 1846. And it's not just that he was German. If you think back in 1848, there was 1846, 47, 48. There's a wave of liberal revolutions that swept Western and Central Europe. These were people who were democracy minded and they wanted change, and they lost. It was very bad. Mm-hmm. A lot of the Germans of that movement came to the United States, and they think, to put it in 2025 terminologies, these were the woke progressives. They were very liberal. They had an attitude. They were very smug and condescending. They did not believe in compromise. They believed in the righteousness of their cause, and anybody who stood against them was wrong. And frankly, they weren't a lot of fun people, to be honest with you. Thomas Nast came from that. Nast comes over when he's 6. He goes to school in New York City. His grades are lousy, but boy, can he draw. From early on. It's obviously he's got an artistic. And his dad was a big was a real acolyte of the liberal reform movement, and so he's got dad's very, 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 we would consider today far left liberal politics. A lot of those Germans, those 1840s German, were militantly behind the Union war effort and when the war between the states came. And Nast, there were 2 major national publications in the very late 1850s going into the Civil War. Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper and Harper's Weekly. They were, think of it as the Time and Newsweek magazines of their days. Yeah. Their day. They had just found out how they could mass produce illustrations. They weren't magazines in the sense we know them today, where they had a slit cover and were stapled. They were more like newspapers, but they just found out how they could mass produce illustrations. They couldn't do photos yet, but they would hire artists to take photos and then draw illustrations of them, or to draw illustrations or cartoons. Okay, and this is where Nast enters the picture, because yes, he's an illustrator. He winds up going back. He works in England for a little while. He winds up in Garibaldi in the very, very late 1850s. Giuseppe Garibaldi, remember, is the George Washington of Italy, who helps unify Italy, and they fight a bunch of wars around just before the outbreak of our Civil War. So he gets battlefield experience, comes back, but cartooning is really where it's at with him. And he bounces back and forth between Harper's and Frank Leslie's. But still, he's young. He's only in his 20s, and he's got a national reputation, and he's working at a national level. In the winter of 1862, the war had been going very badly for the Union war effort. And on December 13th, in particular, they suffered a horrific defeat at Fredericksburg, Virginia. They charged across an open field about a mile, and the Confederates were entrenched up there and just mowed them down. That's the battle, where while he was watching it through his binoculars, Robert E. Lee said, his field glasses, Robert E. Lee said, "It's well that war is terrible, lest we should grow too fond of it." Yeah. So there's profound depression all across the North. And in my upcoming book, Witness to War, they talk about this. And a guy in the Union Army there at Fredericksburg, writing a few days after the battle, said, "We're forced to admit that we're going to have to recognize the Confederacy one way or the other." And I've got a letter from a woman then on the home front written a few days later. It's like, why can't we get it together? And so Thomas Nast draws on several different things to do a morale booster. He draws on the German experience, the German Christmas. He knew the Father Christmas, the St. Nicholas image. And we think, we see these, he's got the long robe all the way down to his feet, and the whole bit. And also Clement Moore's A Visit from St. Nicholas, which we now know as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, had been published in 1823. So he takes, he takes that imagery, he takes his Germanic Christmas traditions, and then his own imagination, and he swirls all three together, and he comes up with the image you're seeing, St. Nicholas visiting, cheering the troop. Now, this was published on January 3rd, 1863. And you think, well, gee, and they're a little late. Yeah, but they were so used to there was a lag after events.
You have the 12 days of Christmas. It's still
So it was still close enough. And people, this really struck a chord with people, right? This Santa Claus.
It struck a chord so much that he continued to do this. This is just the first go at it.
That's right.
You can see he's kind of patriotic. He has the stars. He's got the striped pants. He's a little bit like his later representation of Uncle Sam.
He goes on and he's tinkering around a lot. Santa Claus isn't always in red suit with him. He tries blue, he tries green. Finally, he settles on red. Thomas Nast came up with the whole North Pole Santa's Workshop thing. Thomas Nast came up with the elves. He felt at liberty. He kind of felt like he owned Santa Claus, and he just really, so he makes Santa Claus. He does a whole series of illustrations in Christmas 1863, a year later, because they've been so successful. And he's got one of a soldier, a beautiful image actually, of a Union soldier coming home and his wife hanging. It's at Christmas time, and there's Santa up on the roof. But that really was cheering when people needed a morale boost.
And this is a later depiction that he has. It's interesting. He has the saber on his side. He's got the military pack. I mean, so through all of this, there's using these national symbols, and this is the thing. I say he's kind of a precursor to later Edward Bernays, who's the father of propaganda, and we didn't call it that at this point, but he understood that visuals were more powerful than words, and he's really the one in the United States. And it's because of technology, ultimately, being able to put out these magazines and these newspapers and be able to depict imagery like this, that he was able to do that. And it was very powerful, as you said. And it's part of this becoming a national unity. Go ahead.
And I want to point out too, Dustin, that the pipe he's got, that's called a sexton's or a churchwarden's pipe. It's a long stem, which allows the smoke to be cooler by the time you get it. But what's the nod to soldiers and the military significance of this is that's a clay pipe. And soldiers carried clay pipes with them because if you broke it when you moved around, they were cheap and easily replaced. Also, if you're holding a clay pipe and there's no insulation on it, you got to be very careful. I about burned the dickens out of my hands on one at a Civil War reenactment many years ago. So, but even the pipes got a little connection with soldiers. Thomas Nast, though, as an illustrator after the war, he's now made a name for himself. He's on the map of American illustrators. And Nast seizes on animals because he understands a couple of things. Animals are powerful symbols. Okay. Also, remember, there's two other factors at play here. A whole bunch of people at this period still don't know how to read or can't read very well beyond just mere functioning levels. And number two, there's a huge immigration spike is starting. So there's a lot of people who aren't native English speakers. Someone said these are the people whose lips move when they read because they didn't grow up with English as their language, right? Yeah. So, if you go back at that time, there were symbols that were very important in everyday life, okay? In downtown, remember the red and white stripe pole, the barber's pole?
Yep.
That was there. So when you saw that red and white stripe, you knew that's a barber. If you see 3 gold balls outside a store, that's a pawn shop. If you see a wooden cigar, if you see a wooden Indian, that's a cigar store. If you see a spire with a cross on it, that's a church. These symbols were there for people who couldn't read or had very, very low literary ability. So Thomas Nast recognizes the power of animals that can translate. So,
well, you can see right here, this is his depiction of Uncle Sam, which developed over time. But you see him on a snail, which it says Congress, which is pretty applicable even to this day, and maybe
has not changed.
So the idea that Congress as a snail,
slow. Right. See, again, you don't have to communicate that if you know snail slow as a snail, right? By the way, Uncle Sam was one of his uncle. There was a contractor in upstate New York in the War of 1812 named Samuel Wilson, and I can't remember if it was meat or what, but he had barrels. Whatever it was he supplied was in barrels marked U.S. and people said, "Oh, that stands for Uncle Sam."
Yeah.
And then somehow or another, just these things take on a life of their own. Uncle Sam became morphed into the U.S. government, right? Interestingly, side note, when General Grant comes along and he gets an appointment to West Point, he was born, his name, it's Ulysses Simpson Grant. He was born with the name Hiram Ulysses Grant. And he hated it because the initials spelled hug. And when the congressman made the appointment to West Point, in filling out the appointment, he said, "What's that grandkid's name, Ulysses?" And somebody said, "Oh, his mother was a Simpson. It's probably Ulysses Simpson's Grant." So he writes, he shows up at West Point and he's Ulysses Simpson Grant.
Interesting.
Right? Well, his classmates then started calling him Uncle Sam for U.S. And then his nickname was Sam. Those who knew him very well the rest of his life, it was Sam.
Well,
So
I always say context is decisive. And it's a filter on your life. And this is actually, there's research that back this up, that your name has an impact on what you might do in your life. For instance, if your name is Dennis, you're more likely to become a dentist statistically. So, U.S. Grant, it's not surprising he's becomes a top general and then becomes president of the United States. This was kind of baked into the programming of his name, which I've always thought was interesting.
And then, if you'll forgive me, in February 1862, he wins the first major victory for the Union at Fort Donelson, New York. And the Confederate commander sends a letter saying, "Hey, I'd like to discuss surrendering the fort. What I'd like to meet to discuss terms." And Grant replies very succinctly, this is his entire letter: "No terms except immediate and unconditional surrender can be accepted. I propose to move on your works within an hour." And that's published. So he picks up the name Unconditional Surrender, U.S. Grant. See, Uncle Sam, U.S., Ulysses, I see it all plays. So
Interesting. So you're talking about the animals. Well, before you do that, I've always wondered if Uncle Sam is somewhat, this doesn't look like him as much, but there's other depictions where he looks a little bit like Abraham Lincoln. Is that intentional?
Yeah, I think during the war, they really were trying to tap into that, the lean, tall, however, Nast's caricature, Nast's imagery had become so iconic that by the time the famous James Flagg, "Uncle Sam, I want you," he's pointing a finger here. If I can get my finger in the shot. I got a
which
finger
is 100, almost, or 80 years later, right?
Yeah, right. It's pretty much, we know what Uncle Sam, he has to make Uncle Sam look like that. There's not a lot of variation on that.
Another person whose name had an impact on what they did, Flagg. So going back to the animals, this is one of the things that we still deal with to this day, and people don't think about it much. This is in the Reconstruction era, I believe, where these start to show up. Is that right?
Right. There's two. You've got the Democratic donkey and the Republican elephant. Now, there were a couple of stray portrayals throughout the Civil War of elephants and Republicans, but it never really caught on. In the Reconstruction era, Nast seized upon the elephant for a couple of reasons. One, it was big and clumsy and cumbersome and powerful, and that's where the Republicans were in Reconstruction for 25 years after the war. Also, they kept harping on slavery over and over and over and over, and an elephant never forgets.
Yep.
So that's one of the reasons he definitely put the Republican elephant on the map. Contrary to common belief, he did not invent the Democrat donkey for the Democratic Party. That came about when Andrew Jackson ran for president in the 1820s, and his opponents called him a jackass.
Yeah.
And Old Hickory, he thought that was hilarious. It tickled him. And so in a classic case of running into it, Democrats started calling themselves donkeys. However, Nast exploded the use of the donkey, the Democratic donkey. Interestingly, though, in the 1820s and 30s, most of the Democratic Party used a rooster as their symbol, a bantam cock, a fighting cock, to show they had fighting spirit. And to this day, on the ballots in Kentucky and West Virginia, they still use the rooster. And in 1923, Oklahoma's Democratic Party finally dropped the rooster for for the donkey.
That was one thing I was going to mention, is that used to be common for people who were illiterate to have the pictures, the depictions, the animals for the party that they wanted to vote, and that's how they knew which side they were voting for.
And the to this day, the Democratic Party headquarters of Kentucky is on Interstate 64 outside of Frankfort, and there's a big rooster. But then again, remember, Mark Twain said when the end of the world came, he wanted to be in Kentucky because it was 20 years behind on everything.
That's funny.
He also there's also a misconception that Nast designed Columbia, the woman Columbia representing the United States, with the crown and the flag cape. Again, he didn't create that, but he certainly popularized it. But he used animals, Boss Tweed and the Tweed Ring that ran New York State and Tammany Hall. He was real big. One of the leaders of Tammany, he portrayed as an ostrich because it sticks its head in the sand because he didn't want to know what
his work was pretty good. It was pretty important at making that scandal well known. Is that right?
His work was so important that Theodore Roosevelt later said, quote, "Thomas Nast was our teacher." And that really sums it all. That's all you need to say. Just because, you can look at these pictures and kind of have an idea of what they represent and the story behind them.
Well, speaking of Teddy Roosevelt, who was a New Yorker, we're going to move to New York a few years later. In his era, he was the police commissioner at one point in New York City. But here we see Times Square. This is, I believe, circa 1907. I'm going to show you in a moment here. This is, I think, circa 1938. So a lot happens in that time period. But this is an important moment. So we're moving to New Year's Eve, 1907. They had just banned fireworks, I believe, for
that's the fun part of it. A guy named Adolph Ox is an interesting character. He's from Tennessee. He's the son of Jewish immigrants. And he literally learns the newspaper business from the bottom up, working as a printer's devil, a printer's assistant like Mark Twain did for his brother's newspaper in Knoxville, Tennessee. As a young man in his early 20s, he pulls up the money and buys a newspaper in Chattanooga and really makes a gold mine on that. Okay. And he's talking in 1896 to a reporter from the New York Times, and Ox really wants to get, he's in his 30s now, he's 37, 38, and he really wants to get in New York because that's the Big Apple. Well, this reporter said, hey, you can buy our newspaper for a song. The New York Times had been around since 1851. It's 46 years old. There's dozens of newspapers, and particularly in the 1890s, Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal are just swallowing up the market with yellow journalism, with sensational journalism, right? They realize news is entertainment as much as information, right? So the New York Times looks like a faded rose that stays where behind it. So he buys the New York Times. Ox buys the Times for $75,000, which is about $3 million today. Think about that. That's a bargain.
The free press being purchased by Paramount and CBS was, I think, $200 million.
Yeah,
which is much less. Hadn't been around as long.
Nobody in New York wants it because they think it's a relic. It's on its way out. It's dying. Why bother? Ox was shrewd enough to find a lane in this highly competitive environment. He says, hey, we can't out yellow the yellow journalists. They've already got that market covered. So we're going to carve out a niche for us on the opposite. We're going to be the paper of record. We're going to get it right. We're going to be factual and accurate. He turns out to be a marketing genius. He comes up with the slogan, all the news that's fit to print, right? Which not only is a snappy, good line, but it also says, it communicates we're going with solid, real, dependable, reliable news, right?
Oh,
he builds the New York. Yeah, please, this is not 2025 at all. We're talking about it, but he's going to be, good old, true, real, impartial, fair and balanced journalism. Builds the New York Times building. And then in marketing, he comes up with, as you mentioned, fireworks displays starting in 1904, right? And they're drawing big crowds. They're drawing big crowds. The problem is, after a series of mishaps, New York City in 1907 banned fireworks. Okay. Well, now he's got this tradition because, by the way, this used to be called Longacre Square. Now it becomes Times Square. So he's got 3 years running of this New Year's Eve tradition starting. You don't want to let go of it. What do? So he turns to the new thing that everybody's having fun with, electricity. And they get a ball with 100 incandescent light bulbs, which basically, I'm talking about, the light bulbs like you screw in your lamp, the old flat round, 100 of them, and they lower it manually for 60 seconds. And everybody's just mesmerized. They just think this is the coolest thing on earth. This is the future. This is high tech. This is glitz. And 200,000 people showed up to watch it. And it became such a hit that they continued it. And then next week, for comparison, from 100 old-fashioned light bulbs, they are going to be dropping a 6-ton LED-covered geodesic sphere. It's not even a ball anymore, with all kinds of light symmetry and flashing and jazz. But it's been going on every year since 1907, with the exception of 1942 and 43 because of blackouts in World War II.
Well, it's interesting. So you see, this is 1907. This is what the square looked like, and then this is 1938 or so, and just how much I don't know. I imagine it's that moment of having electricity and celebrating America coming into the modern age and technology. But you fast forward about 30 years, and this is what Times Square becomes. And to this day, it's all about light and electricity. That is what Times Square is.
And to their credit, in 1907, they still had 200,000 people show up.
That's amazing.
So it's always been, once he put that New Year's Eve event on the map, New York just took to it like a duck to water. It's just, but it was adding the electricity and the lights and the sparkle. And I've often wondered, how many times do they have to manually with levers practice the timing to get it for 60 seconds? To make sure they do.
So moving on, and this is most interesting. The story we're going to talk about isn't completely about Christmas, but it's definitely about Christmas. And that is Gene Shepherd, who is the author of A Christmas Story, which is a lot of families, it's their most cherished and beloved Christmas movie. My family loves it. But those stories are all stories that he created and he developed in his writing, but also as a talk radio show host, who was really the first talk radio show host. And what we're going to talk about in a moment is media manipulation, and how in the New York Times, as we're going to talk about in a second, we're 50 years past when they had the ball drop. But there was a little bit of fake news at that point, a little bit of fabricated journalism, and he wanted to point that out. So he's known for A Christmas Story, which feel like real stories, but they're all made up, right? About kind of apocryphal of his childhood. But really, what he's known for is I Libertine, which is well, why don't you tell us the story of that?
Before we get going, can I just say one word on A Christmas Story on a personal note? The Christmas Story comes out in 1983. And if you go 60s and 70s, early 80s, Christmas movies were notoriously bad. They were cheap, they were childish, poorly made, thrown together, right? And so Christmas Story has just come out, and my mother, I've just graduated from college. I've just turned 23 2 weeks before, and my mom wants to take the whole family out. We're going to go see A Christmas Story. Then we're going to go out for supper. And I went kicking and dragging because I'm 23. I know everything. And Christmas, dumb. Everyone like do it to make mom happy. Well, it turned out to be a hilarious, wonderful movie, and much of America fell in love with it. And I've seen it every year since. I just watched it Sunday night. and and by the way, then that movie was such a surprise sleeper hit financially at the box office that it sparked a whole renaissance of Christmas movies. The Santa Claus, Elf, all in the 80s, in the late 80s and 90s and O's. So it literally breathed new life into the Christmas movie genre. But if you've seen it, Gene Shepard wrote the script, and Gene Shepard is the narrator. That's his voice that you hear. And he cobbled it together.
That is what Gene Shepard looked like, isn't it? Is it not?
What's that?
The picture we have on here that is depicting him in an old fashioned garb.
That's kind of well, no, that's not him. He's on the back of it as shown as the author. That was just an illustration. Sorry.
We'll get to that in one moment.
So Gene Shepard is an interesting guy. He's from Hammond, Indiana, and fought in World War II and comes back home, and he gets into broadcasting. And if you think back to him in the movie, he's got this beautiful, magnificent, lush voice. And he was one of the greatest storytellers of all times. And when he starts telling a story, that voice and his language is so rich and colorful, he just sucks you and draws you right in. You have to listen. You have to stop what you're doing.
A lot of people compare him to Garrison Keillor. They're very similar, and in their approach and their technique. And in the 1950s, radio is a medium that's struggling to introduce it, to reinvent itself and establish relevance. Radio has been the big television. Yeah, radio has been the big kahuna in broadcasting for 25 years, and now TV's come and TV just knocks it off the pedestal. And they don't know what to do. I mean, it had been programming, and so in the 50s, they're coming up with playing recorded music. It used to be live music. No one wanted to hear, why listen to records on the radio? They wanted to hear live broadcasts. Well, now they're saying, hey, with rock and roll and this surge, this baby boom of baby boomers hitting adolescence, we can do that. And one of the things they're inventing is the talk radio show format. Now, remember, talk radio didn't exist. It's got to be created at some point. Gene Shepard gets the spot on WOR, this 100,000 watt powerhouse radio station in New York. It's the big time of broadcasting. Okay, yeah. That's a big deal to be hired by WOR. And he's hired starting in 1955, and he works the shift most people dread above all others, the graveyard shift from midnight to 6 a.m. Okay. Remember, in the late 1950s, it's not a 24-hour society like it was. TV stations go off the air at 10 or 11 at midnight. There's not a lot of places. There's not a lot of convenience stores. And even New York City, which is famous for its nightlife, even then, there wasn't all that much to do. Shepard just loves it because he can just talk at length. He can just ramble. And as long as he doesn't get his station in trouble with the FCC, he can pretty much do and say whatever he wants because the bosses are asleep.
Yeah, the bosses are asleep and sound in bed, and he really develops a very strong following, particularly among young and upcomers. Jack Kerouac, Lenny Bruce, the comedian, they're following him as young men. They love these stories. And by the way, if you ever have some spare time, there are many of clips of him on YouTube. Just Google Gene Shepard, spelled with a J, Jean, Gene Shepard, and listen to these stories, and you'll understand what I mean. They just draw you in. And he makes up stories about Ralphie and the old man and the little brother and Flick and Schwartz and and his own experiences. And but he also could just ramble at anything that struck his fancy. Right.
Well, 6 hours. There's not very many shows that are 6 hour long shows, so he had to just create all this stuff.
Right.
I think it's important to mention though, the midnight to 6 a.m. it's 100,000 watt station, so it's already, what that means is that its signal goes very far. But where I live in Virginia, and I'm not even sure, I might even go to
I think we went to Cuba on nights.
So we can get WOR now, and you can get or any of the New York stations at night. At night, because of the way AM works, it goes even further. So he had an even larger reach than the primetime folks because he was at the night shift.
Yeah, some AM radio stations were called sundowners because they were required to sign off at sunset. Well, that fleet freed up the airwaves to expand. There was less competition, so it went even further. So it was a big deal. So he's doing this, and being a Midwesterner from the industrial Midwest, he has that kind of sensibility. And one of the things about New York, he likes New York, he likes New Yorkers, but one of the things he can't get over is New Yorkers' slavish addiction, obsession with top 10 lists, top 10 best movies, top 10 fashion trends, top 10 this, and they still use them and they still love them. They still are big on them. But the one that really galled him was the New York Times bestsellers list. Right? Because at that time, the name was misleading. The formula they used,
and still to this day,
their algorithm is they called bookstores and said, what titles are people asking for? Not just selling. What titles, what authors are they requesting? And they just kind of came up with a list, right? And one night, he's just really, the spring of 1955, he's just really revved up on this. He's dropped a quarter in his own slot. And he says, and it's just coming to him on the spur of the moment. He's like, I'll bet we could create a fictitious book with a fictitious author. And if enough people start hanging out, we could get a book on the New York Times bestseller list, right? Well, his fans who called themselves the Night People, right? The Night People start calling in and say, this is a great idea. Let's do it. They're flooding the airways. Well, that just gets him going.
Because he's broadcast so far and with such reach across the country, this is happening all over the place.
Well, yeah, but New York is really the bread and butter of the market on this particular hoax, right? So the fans are saying, great idea, count me in, they'll go for it, right? And so they concoct this on the air. There's no scheming, no conspiracy. This is on the public airwaves, right? And they come up with this idea for a book called I, Libertine, set during the Georgian era, late 1700s, early 1800s, right? And they create the author Frederick R. Ewing, and I mean, Shepard just goes to town. He creates a whole persona. Frederick R. Ewing is a retired English Army officer who lives on a country estate. He's got a wife, Marjorie, and the whole bit, right? So they all agree that on such and such a date, they're going to start bombarding news stores and bookstores. And remember, this is before Barnes and Noble. This is before Books A Million. These are independent little mom and pop retailers, some stores larger than others, but they're not huge chains, right? And they all go out and they start reporting the next day and calling in and telling him. One guy says, I went in, and the very snooty bookstore owner, and he says, Frederick Ewington, I'm glad to see he's getting the recognition he's always deserved. I've always thought he was underrated. And, they got to know more than you, right? And it keeps going and it keeps going and it keeps going. And they just take this ball and run with it. And sure enough, a couple of weeks later, it makes the New York Times bestseller list. Well, this only encourages them. They don't stop. Okay.
Exactly.
And
there's a reason why this I have this picture because it keeps going.
And one college student, he didn't say, it was implied it was Rutgers, writes, for an English class, a qualified look at the works of Frederick R. Ewing. And the professor writes on it, B+, outstanding research, underlined. And the college student said, I think my whole education is a fraud. Probably now. And one woman says she's at her bridge party. And so she mentions I, Libertine. 3 women swear they've read it, and 2 of them start arguing over which chapters they like the best, right? And my personal favorite was a New York literary gossip columnist for the New York Times writes, had a wonderful lunch the other day with Frederick Ewing and his delightful wife Marjorie. They don't even exist, right? So the real life Gene Shepard is having lunch one day with a friend of his, and the publisher of Ballantine Books is there, and the friend knows about this prank, right? And he said, "Hey," to the publisher, would you like to meet the author of I, Libertine? He's here right now." And the guy's looking around the room and he goes, "Really? Every publisher in town wants to get the hold of that title. Where is he?" And he points and he goes, "Right there," and they let him in on it. And they finally, and Shepard, in a very democratic, lowercase small d, democratic way, the Night people all agree, okay, it's been fun, but they said, we're going to actually write an I Libertine now. And it made the New York Times. It made the front page of the New York Times. The story was a tempest in teapot for a week. Pravda, the Soviet Union's official news agency, Pravda, ran a big article about how evil capitalist media control the peasants with lies and manipulation. So they actually come up with a book called I Libertine by Frederick Ewing, and Shepard's pictures on the back as the author. It's very funny. He's got his glasses down like this, and he looks very woebegone. He's trying to look very academic. And in a totally classy move, because remember, Shepard wasn't trying to commit a fraud. He was trying to expose.
He did this all out in the open.
He was trying to expose the ridiculous of these lists. He
Well,
donated.
it shows how much
he donated all his money that he made off the book to charity, and it's still available on Amazon. You can still find copies of it, the original 1950s, on eBay. I just downloaded a copy on Kindle the other day. I got to get around to reading it. That's my holiday reading.
Well, my favorite. Well, they have a quote here: "Gadzooks, quoth I, but here's a saucy bod." It's I don't know if it's high literature or not, but it's
what was true in 1955 is still true in 2025. Herd mentality, whether it's politics and voting, or whether it's what a popular movie or a popular book or a popular song. If the herd is going for it, I must be part of it too. Well,
this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this story, because this is revealing how media works, how media manipulation works, how you can manufacture consent, and how a lot of news is actually fabricated. The New York Times bestseller list is not much different today than it was back then. It's the Amazon bestseller list is a much better gauge of whether your book is selling. It's less about who you know and connections and other things. So it's interesting you mentioned the friend who was there. Wasn't he the Wall Street Journal reporter? I know it was the Wall Street Journal that actually wrote the article exposing.
Yeah, he wasn't. The Wall Street Journal reporter wasn't at that lunch, but the Wall Street Journal reporter did find out about it, and he did. He was a listener and he was a fan, and he did say to Gene Shepard, "Hey, we got a bullet. Is it okay? You mind if I do?" He didn't just run the story, and Shepard said, "Yeah."
Of course, it was the Wall Street Journal, competitor to the New York Times.
The New York Times.
Always
make your competitor look bad.
Of course. And then we see that to this day, where Fox News will report about CNN, CNN will report about Fox News, and they all are taking a dig. Which, by the way, when you're watching the news and there's any news about the news, and you're watching whatever network or whatever it is, just realize that you have basically billionaires going after each other, and they're using their publications that they own to do so. And that's just how the media works. But this is a perfect example. To this day, a lot of the online influencers are paid. There's a whole market for influencers. And when the movie's coming out, you will have people who are either promoting the movie, or sometimes you'll have people who are being paid to actively go out there and say the movie's terrible because this company wants the other company not to do so well. So I mean, this stuff continues to happen. He proved it by having this whole scam out in the open, and I think it's hilarious.
It just proves the truth of what Harry Truman said: the only thing new in life is the history you don't know.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Well, this has been fun. I've enjoyed walking through the history of Christmas and New Year's with you, Mark. And I'd like people to know a little bit more about Witness to War, which is going to be released early February. People can pre-order right now on Amazon, which is a big deal for authors if people pre-order their books. So tell us a little bit about that. I know on Thanksgiving we talked about at least one lady's letter. Then you mentioned some messages. Just tell us a little bit about what that book is and why you wrote it.
Yeah, you mentioned the Amazon bestseller list. That's my prayer right now to make that. I've been a lifelong Civil War nut since third grade, and I've been a writer since about that time too. I know I recognized I was a writer very early on, and one of the ways I connected with people of the period is through their words, their writing. And I've always had a great fondness for letters from the Civil War, because they were very they just let it all out. They never imagined anyone would ever be reading this. It wasn't intended for anyone else to read. And fortunately for us, the mid-Victorians were huge pack rats. They saved everything, right? And the quality of the paper they wrote on had more linen in it and less chemicals than today, so the papers lasted. And so consequently, we have these beautiful in the moment accounts, not diaries, not recollections, not official reports where they're covering their ass or tooting their own horn, but what it was like. And I've always since a kid wanted to know what it was like to live through that experience, both to be a soldier fighting in the war, a home front, and starting in 1989, I began collecting letters whenever I could afford to buy one here and there. And one day in 2014, I bought a letter, and for whatever reason, it had to be delivered to the post office. They didn't send it to the house. And I've gone to pick it up, and I'm driving home, and I'm thinking, as I'm driving, how the content of this new letter connected to the content of another letter I already had. And at that moment, I had this epiphany. What if I assembled an entire collection where you can follow from Lincoln's election in 1860 until the guys come home in 1865, the entire war as it unfolds in real time, right?
Yeah.
And with no modern interpretation, just their words, their feelings, their thoughts, their fears, their hopes, their views. And so I put together an outline, and from that moment on, every letter I acquired was with does this fill a gap in the narrative? Does this keep the narrative moving forward? And so now, 35 years and 560 letters later, I've put it all together in Witness to War, as we say, 432 witnesses, one amazing story. And they tell us what it's like in no holds bars language. And it's as close as you can get to actually asking someone, what was it like? There are no famous generals. There are no famous statesmen. And I did not want those. Their books and their letters are out there. I wanted what everyday people to experience, to tell their experience in their own words. There's a letter of a Union officer writing to his wife during the Battle of Nashville. While that battle is in progress, it starts at noon, and he's describing the fighting. Then he writes it at 1. And he's starting to get nervous at 1. And then he writes at 2, and then he's killed in an attack 30 minutes later. I've never even seen a letter where a guy's describing the battle he's killed in as it's going on.
That's great.
There's a letter from a woman writing to her husband, begging him to desert. And she says, and here's how you can do it. I can mail you a box of civilian clothes. I mean, she's put a lot of thought into this, right? There's a letter where a slave, a 23-year-old young slave in Washington, D.C., is writing to his owner asking for his emancipation papers. Slaves were not allowed by law in most southern states to read and write. And so letters from documented slaves are rare as angels. So it's an account, and you watch the war as it unfolds in real time, the whole arc and sweep of it. There's raw war fever and war patriotism. They get into it, and it's like, oh my gosh, what have we done?
Yep.
And then it's like, oh, they're so sick. In 1864, they're all sick of it. One soldier writes, I just want the war to end, and I don't care how it terminates, And then finally at the end, boom, and everything all happens. And, Lincoln is killed and the South surrenders, and it's all over. So
it's fascinating. I'm looking forward to it myself. I've already pre-ordered copies of it, and I know a lot of people have as well.
It's available, as we said, on Amazon.com, Witness to War, J. Mark Powell. If you don't have an Amazon account, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Simon & Schuster, you can order it there. And the release date is February 3rd. And lastly, Dustin, like I said, no one ever intended for these letters to be written. I've got one where the guy writes to his wife, please burn this letter. I'm reading it.
Awesome.
When I make it to heaven, there's going to be 430 people on the other side of the pearly gate saying, we've been waiting to have we've been waiting to have a word with you, Mister.
That's funny.
It's
Well,
a fun, and it's a fast read too. It's not boring. It's clips along very fast. So.
I think I told you this before, but what I do as a pollster when I'm in the media, my intention is to give voice to the American public who don't usually get to have their opinion to be a part of the conversation. It's whoever is on the panel, but I like to try to give voice to the American people, and I think that's what you've done in this book. Is everyday people get a chance to have their say and be added to the conversation. So I think you've done a great job with that. I'm looking forward to it. Everything I've seen so far has been great with it. And as people can see today, we've gone through a lot of different interesting history stories that Mark is a really good storyteller when it comes to bringing these things to life, and hopefully walking through these stories today, you can see how these holidays are actually very important to helping kind of create the character and the image and the ideal of who we are as Americans. And as we go into the 250th anniversary of our country, this is something that hopefully we can lean into national unity and the sense of patriotism and who we are as a country, in that ideal.
Absolutely.
Well,
Absolutely.
thank you,
Thank you
Mark.
for having me. It's been a lot of fun as always. And Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you and yours and to everyone watching.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. All right, that was J. Mark Powell. Be sure to go out and get his new book, Witness to War, and pre-order that on Amazon or wherever you'd like to buy your books, and do check that out. We appreciate him coming on. And also, I didn't mention before, but he's the syndicated columnist of Holy Cow History, so you can check that out in your local newspaper. It goes all across the country, so do check that out. Thank you to him. Thank you to all of you who have supported Political Trade Secrets. Do like, follow, and subscribe. That's the best way to support the program. Also, make sure that you get all of our new episodes. As you know, we like to pull back the curtain and look under the hood and reveal how politics actually works, how the media actually works. Even though we're having fun talking about Christmas and New Year's, there's a lot of opportunities to see how things might actually work that you may not have known before. So that's what we seek to do here. But thank you so much. Merry Christmas to you and your family. Happy New Year. I'm looking forward to the best for you and for our country in 2026 as we celebrate our 250th anniversary of this country and the opportunity to be Americans and be part of this American family. So with that, thank you and Merry Christmas.
Join us next time by subscribing on iTunes and get show notes and sign up for our newsletter at politicaltradesecrets.com.